This video is sponsored by ThingPenguin.com. RidleyReport.com is the website. Dave Ridley is the complainer, and I'm Dave Ridley. So, here are some more things I had to complain about over the last couple of months. You know, you can think of this as a news roundup because it's really sort of, again, my main activism in New Hampshire, now that I've kind of been deplatformed off the YouTube, at least, shadow banned 4 times and increasingly weakened on YouTube. The thing that I do the most is calling talk radio, and I've discovered if I go through and look at my talk radio calls, it's often like a laundry list of all the news items that never made it into the mainstream press. Or maybe it's my take on a news item that never made it into the mainstream press. But in any case, if you find it interesting, and if you like to know some of the news that is behind the scenes in New Hampshire, then I should just be kind of telling you what I called talk radio about. Now, I don't record usually those talk radio calls because of the wiretapping law in New Hampshire, and also because of the fact that a recorded call, it would it really be considered my property, or is it the property of the show that I called into? For instance, if they record it, I don't know if I can actually take that and put an ad in it and put it on YouTube and show it to you for profit. So you have to deal with the executive summary, I guess. Anyway, so going back to my records, on August 30, I called the Jim Polito show in Massachusetts. I don't know where they broadcast. I don't know where their station is in Massachusetts, but I was calling to. It says I was calling to talk about NHexit stuff. So I'm putting that in a different podcast. Or actually, the New Hampshire the NHexit news is all gradually making it into the NHexit.org podcast, which I would just recommend dropping by NHexit.org, and you'll see that news or most of it there eventually. But on the same day, on August 30th, I called into the Bill Bunkley show in Florida, and I told them something that you may also find interesting. So in August, there was a rare interview with Kamala Harris after she had become the nominee for, the supposed nominee or whatever you want to call it, for president for the Democrat Party. And what was interesting for me, and that is the lady who interviewed her, this rare person who was so friendly to her that they would let her interview her. This was Dana Bash of CNN. And I had actually met Bash back in 2012 at a Ron Paul event. I tried to interview her. You can see all the video. I recorded more or less everything that happened. And it was kind of, so some other Ron Paul people had gone up and sort of ambush interviewed her while she was at the event because they didn't really like her reporting. She had said something on the air. She said she was worried that Ron Paul might become president, even though she's not supposed to be some sort of editorial columnist or something like that. She's just supposed to be a street reporter, at least back then. But CNN was really showing its colors, and these guys, they ambush interviewed her, put it on the air, and that was before I got there. I did something similar, but I didn't really ambush interview. I just walked up to her and asked her if I could do an interview with her at some point in the following hour, right? And she seemed to indicate that I could, and I just kind of waited. I guess it must not have been an hour that I was talking about. Maybe a little more like, I was kind of talking about interviewing her right then, but I was willing to wait a few minutes, and so I stood around for a few minutes, and then I followed up with her and said, "So are you ready?" and she said, "No. I think she must have misunderstood me, and she said, "No, I can't do an interview with you. I'm working right now," which is fair, and she was polite enough. But what was interesting was her photographer kind of freaked out a little bit. It wasn't like he started waving his arms around or threatening me. It was the way he was looking at me. And you can see it. Again, this is why video is so important. I just filmed the way he was looking at me. He took some pictures of me, completely within his rights. He didn't violate any of my rights. But it was just the look on his face it speaks for itself. You should watch the video sometime. It's called CNN Stares Me Down. So this proved to be a useful anecdotal experience that allowed me to call talk radio and talk on topic about New Hampshire and Ron Paul and the Free State Project and all those other things that I try to get into in my talk radio calls if I can. I called a different show either in Delaware or Connecticut about it, and they were really excited that I had some sort of relevant experience to talk about. Talk radios are not always excited to hear from me. All right, so what else is on my records here? More NHexit calls, which I won't discuss on this podcast. Let's see. So this is not news that is unique to my channel or anything. It was in the mainstream press, but I called into Free Talk Live on September 14th, 2024, to talk about the fact that apparently a coalition of U.S. states has joined a lawsuit against the federal government. New Hampshire is one of the states that's joined the coalition, and they're trying to. I guess the feds are trying to make them underwrite certain undocumented immigrants with Medicare or whatnot, and they're trying to resist that. This is a lawsuit led by Kansas, according to the news source. I don't think I wrote down what the news source was. Anyway, I don't know where that stands. This is probably 2-month-old news already. But for what it's worth, New Hampshire is standing up to the feds on another issue. Now, I listened to a podcast a while back, which was I don't know if it was a podcast, it was a debate between Anthony Pompliano, who is sort of a Bitcoin expert and Bitcoin fan, arguing with a Bitcoin foe. And this was not a spontaneous thing. I think it was a preset debate. And I have to tell you, this was the most interesting debate I think I've ever heard in my life. And the reason it was so interesting was because of how outlandish the arguments were. The arguments that were being made by the Bitcoin foe were so outlandish that I actually took notes. I went back and listened to the whole thing again and took notes on all the things that guy said. They're useful for a good laugh. So if you go to, I think it's called Anthony Pompliano Best Bitcoin Debate. That's what it was called on the YouTube file that I downloaded. Go listen to it for yourself. If you don't happen to get around to it, I'll give you a summary of my notes. So being as I am more liberty partisan than reporter, I have a policy of not speaking the names of our enemies in many cases, because it just increases their name recognition. It gives them more power. So if you want to figure out what the guy's name is, you'll have to watch the video, the original video. The Best Bitcoin Debate, Anthony Pompliano, something like that. And again, Pompliano is our ally. He's the pro-Bitcoin guy. So the guy he was debating, whose name again I will not speak, is kind of the stupidest smart guy in the known universe. He's able to put grammatically correct sentences together, but wow, just wow. Okay, so here's one of his grievances. Young Bitcoiners might stop working because they're making too much money in Bitcoin. That would be bad for society. These aren't exact quotes, by the way, although I do have some exact quotes. He says Bitcoin relies on economic principles. That's one thing that's bad about it. The Bitcoin industry is not enough like Wall Street. It needs to be more like Wall Street. Foreign actors may have supported Bitcoin. Crypto kitties are bad. Bitcoin has allowed artistic people to make too much money. Central banks are not going to embrace it. And speaking of central banks, inflation is actually not that big a deal because it mostly just affects old people. Bitcoin undermines governments. But he admits, he says, quote, "I'm not suggesting this is a terrible store of value," unquote. He says, quote, "Those appointed regulators that you dismiss are ultimately going to play a much larger role than the politicians that you can cite from Wyoming or elsewhere who get perfect scores from the NRA," unquote. He warns that some of these politicians are against the Green New Deal. And he says, quote, "Look at the bedfellows that you have." The one interesting, well, I don't know, interesting is not the word. The one useful argument he seemed to make against Bitcoin, though, is that he claimed that with $7 billion, you could destroy the Bitcoin network. Not for profit, but for the purpose of just destroying it. That's the empty block theory, that someone could put empty blocks, start dumping empty blocks into the blockchains and whatnot. But my understanding is that that's actually not the biggest threat to Bitcoin. There are other things that could be done that would be worse than that and easier than that, or at least worse than that. So it is useful. It's always useful to be looking on the horizon for anything that could break Bitcoin. So that I did find that interesting, and I did follow up on that. By researching it a little bit, although I don't claim to understand all of that kind of thing. Anyway, so here's my favorite argument that he used against Bitcoin. Chinese people use it. I kid you not. You just got to go listen. You got to listen to it to hear it. You got to listen to it to believe it. So anyway, that's, just to me, I've never heard arguments that made me feel so confident about Bitcoin. By their grievances shall ye know them. If that's what they don't like about Bitcoin, if that's what the man doesn't like about Bitcoin, then I really, really like Bitcoin. Maybe something changes, maybe something goes wrong eventually, but by their grievances shall ye know them. And look at those crappy grievances. Okay. Now, there is something else going on that I have not called talk radio about, mainly because it's just, I get confused about all the details here. I've seen so many different posts and articles about it. I'm kind of forgetting exactly what happened. But I guess Joseph Hart from the YouTube channel Breaking the Flaw has gotten arrested once or twice. And I think once was for maybe just being in a courthouse or something like that. So I would recommend going to freekeen.com and just checking up on what Breaking the Flaw has been up to and what he's been suffering. Again, there's kind of so much there that I've just lost track of it, and I don't have good information right off the top of my head to share with you. But I sometimes I say I'm more of a redirector than a reporter. There's all kinds of things I'm better at than reporter. But redirector, yeah, I can redirect your attention to freekeen.com. And Brad Jardis, who was a former police officer in New Hampshire and a great friend of the Liberty Movement, he has been representing Joseph pro se in at least one of these cases, and he's been posting details. So head over there, take a look. Whenever a fellow videographer is arrested, I should be doing something about it, and at least I can tell you about it. I was listening to WDEL in Delaware in September of 2024, and they were, I was trying to find something that would give me an excuse to call in and talk up some sort of New Hampshire news. But every once in a while, when I make these calls, what will happen is I call in and I'm not actually able to bring New Hampshire into it or the Free State Project or any really actionable item, and I just become another caller who's just kind of talking about policy in general, which is really not ideal. I mean, I'm not trying to save Delaware, right? I'm trying to get the people in Delaware to move to New Hampshire. But you can't just talk about that every time you call in. So anyway, they were talking about the fact that the Teamsters did not endorse Kamala Harris for 2024. And I called in and I just basically pointed out this theory that I've had over a while, over a period of time. If you think about it, if you go back to Poland in the early 80s, I wouldn't say that the unions were necessarily the leaders, but they were a decisive factor in pulling Poland out of the Soviet Union. And so whenever Americans get angry at union power, as they often should be angry, it's important to always keep in the back of our mind that those unions could become big allies at some point. When even they are on our side, maybe there's not much time left for the man. Anyway, I made that point on WDEL, and it probably wasn't very efficient. And it didn't bring anyone to New Hampshire. But my other calls are, more useful. Speaking of which, the next one was on September 20th, and that was a call to WCRN in Worcester, Massachusetts, and I called to talk about that same piece of news that I was mentioning earlier about the coalition of U.S. states that have filed a lawsuit against the federal government. And it's interesting, whenever I call WCRN, they have a thing called free, I guess it's First Amendment Friday. So on Fridays, you can call in and change the subject. So, and it's really an easy show to call. But they do mostly seem to lean authoritarian and mainstream and whatnot. So they're not always real thrilled with my calls. But whenever I call, they will just assume I'm going to talk about NHexit because I talk about it, maybe a third of the time or quarter of the, or half the time when I call in. But it's, again, NHexit is such a luminous issue that it's like it sucks all the air out of the room and people can't think of anything else. It's like they forget everything else I've ever said and all they can remember is that I'm a secessionist for New Hampshire. I've been on Free Talk Live a couple times in late September to talk about another news issue, but this is not a news issue that you are just going to get from me. This is all over the national press about New Hampshire. There was going back to the beginning, there was a House bill that actually was signed into law which forbade biological males from playing on girls' sports teams, and I believe this affected private schools, not just public schools. So this is a problem. Now, in reaction to this, I guess one student sued in federal court, and no longer is the state able to enforce this law. I don't think it was in effect for very long at all, maybe just weeks. It's interesting how the federal government moves so fast against certain things and just blows off others, but anyway, in Bow, New Hampshire, this student was playing on a team against Bow, and that's how I recall it, and some Bow parents wore pink armbands with two X's on them in protest of what they called a biological male, playing on the other team. Now that's probably a little bit eyebrow raising. I mean, how much hate do you want to throw at a 15-year-old? I don't know if hate's the right word for it, but it's not what I would do. But of course, the government overreacted and ordered two parents. They issued them police no trespass orders, keeping them away from their own children's school and school events, or at least I'm not sure if they were banned from school property completely. They were banned from school sporting events for a period. This prompted reopennh.com to call for more parents to show up with pink armbands. When this happened a few days later, no one was ordered to leave. The two parents who were ordered to leave, well, someone has, I don't know if it was either of those parents, but someone more or less immediately sued the Bow, I believe it was the Bow School District. Anyway, they sued over this free speech restriction. I'm not heavily focused on this issue just because it's already well handled. The mainstream press is doing a good job of covering it, and for once, I think the word "good job" actually applies. The articles that I've seen have been pretty fairly written. The ones in New Hampshire newspapers. Actually, there was one that was actually a little bit unfair to the what you might call the pro-trans side. It was seemed a little bit biased in favor of the parents wearing pink. But again, all they did was wear a color with and some letters of the alphabet. They didn't use the government against anyone. At least not that day. Now, let's see. Oh, I'm still recording. Okay, so yeah, there are a lot more calls that I made, and I will catch you up on those later. RidleyReport.com out.
Do you value your privacy? Want hardware that works? Get Linux at New Hampshire's very own penguin.com.